happens when your brain goes off. Because we can't do Christ is risen anymore. We have to do the tropar for. So let's pray. Hi, how are you? All right. Thou hast ascended in glory of Christ our God, granting joy to thy disciples by the promise of the Holy Spirit. Through the blessings they were assured that thou art the Son of God, the Redeemer of the world. Amen. Through the prayers of the Holy Fathers of Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Did you get my email?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
Because you sent me another one that I didn't.
Yeah. So, I'm going to state right out front, I am the most unqualified person to teach a class on monasticism because I am not a monk, right? Nor do I plan to be a monk. I spent a week in a monastery, and that was enough. It's an important part of the life of the church. In fact, the old sort of Orthodox wives' tale is when there are no more monks or nuns left, the world ends. Right? Because, we're such happy, optimistic people. But it's true in a sense, because a monk and a nun's job is to pray for the world. That's their job. And so it's important for us to kind of support that vocation of monasticism and to be able to ensure that they're praying for us. I know for a fact we've got monasteries all over the place that are praying for us in this parish. And when there are people who are sick, I'll send it to an abbot I know or an abbess and say, please keep so-and-so in your prayers. I think that's a beautiful way in which we kind of manifest ourselves. Interestingly, today, just came across the news, the oldest monastery in the world, which is an Orthodox monastery, St. Catherine's, at the foot of Mount Sinai in the Egyptian desert. The Egyptian government, and they've been pushing them really hard, they seized their property today, and they're trying to kick the monks out.
I heard that it wasn't true.
So there's stuff coming, but
nobody knows yet.
No one knows, because I've been to St. Catherine's. It's in the middle of the Sinai desert. It's not like news is going to come out there. So I want to talk a little bit about monasticism, but I also want to talk a little bit about what we call asceticism. And everyone thinks that there are absolutely connected between monks and nuns and asceticism, but it's also our sort of asceticism. So, the monastic tradition of the church, and when you speak of the monastic tradition, we're speaking nuns and monks. They both live according to the same exact rules. They were established by St. Anthony very, very early on in the church, like 2nd century, and St. Basil, who kind of codified them. But they all live by the same rules. So we don't have different orders, like you'll have like the Catholics will have the Franciscans and the Jesuits and the Dominicans and stuff, all with different focus. They all live by the same rules. The only difference is that certain monasteries may have this function or may do this type of thing, but they're all living by the same rules. And I encourage you, we're going to have a trip here. I think, did you go on that trip to St. Egon's? No, you didn't. A couple of the young men went out to our monastery in Pennsylvania to visit them and to kind of, see how our monks are living there. There's a few monasteries around, both men and women. So they are a group of men or women who have taken up the life of prayer, asceticism, fasting, chastity, celibacy, poverty, and strict obedience. Most monks and all nuns are lay people. All right, so they're not like, not all of them are clergy. They're all lay people. St. Herman, our great saint in America, was a layperson, a simple monk. Now there's orders in which we'll talk about, orders of which they are, but they're all lay people. Monks comes from the word monachos in Greek, which means alone. So very briefly, is that for me? Oh, okay. Who's that from? Oh, okay. Thank you. She's been here enough. So clearly throughout the Old Testament, there were this idea of people living a solitary life who would leave the world to pray for the world. And we see that and those groups develop mostly in the desert, which is really interesting. There's a wonderful book which talks about early Christian monasticism called When the Desert Became a City. In other words, all these people were fleeing and trying to live this solitary life in the desert. There were so many of them that they weren't actually solitary anymore. So, but the idea was, hi, how you doing? And you are?
I'm having stuff.
No, please, sit down. Yeah, it's okay. Anyway, so the idea is that they live a life of prayer. Now, there's different types of monastics. There are those who live what's called a cenobitic life. In other words, they hold everything in common. There are some who will live a kind of they'll kind of be isolated, but there'll be a group of them together. And then there are some who live very much a hermit's life. They live by themselves, which is quite difficult, I think, to do. And none of them, there are some even within big monasteries who may live off by themselves, but not unless their abbot or abbess gives them permission. So it's not like they just sort of make up their own mind. So they, it's often said, they live like angels, as we're supposed to be. First off, all monastics are strict vegetarians. I guess you would call it vegan now. So for them, it's good that they get to eat fish. That's like a woohoo sort of thing. But they live that way as a way of self-denial. They live a strict order of prayer and life. So we see bits and pieces of it in parish life, because much of our services are based on that, because that's where they were developed in the monasteries. But they are constantly gathering together to do prayer. Constantly, and then having that opportunity, again, to do that. And then they have particular jobs and stuff. The most famous of the Orthodox monasteries is Mount Athos, which is a peninsula in Greece. It's entirely dedicated. There's 20 some odd monasteries there from different nationalities and stuff. It is said it is harder to be accepted to be a monk on Mount Athos than it is to get into Harvard. That's how strict they are about people getting accepted. I know a few people who were there. There are no women allowed on there. So sorry, ladies, you can never visit Mount Athos. I've never been there, actually. Because the whole place is dedicated to the Theotokos, to Mary. And that is considered, she is the only woman. And so that it is also because they live in strict segregation from the world.
Yeah, because it's because all the monasteries are all
they're either all men or they're all women. Now, sometimes you may have adjacent monasteries. This may be the men's monastery. This may be the women's monastery. But there's a strict division between them and how they live. We'll get into some of this stuff. But it is often said that their example is St. John the Baptist. He was what was called an Essene, which was a very disciplined religious order under Judaism. And that he lived in the desert, right? And he lived this life of prayer, and he ate that simple life. He didn't eat locusts. He didn't eat bugs. That's one of my things. The locust plant is a plant found in the desert that actually has a bloom that you can eat that's edible, right? It's like,
you did. Back then it was different.
No, but the whole point is they're vegetarians. They're not going to eat bugs. So look it up. You don't believe me? Look up the locust plant, and you'll see that's what they're talking about. Okay, so anyway, I went off on my thing. So how did this whole... There was clearly a Jewish tradition of this solitary life, clearly a Jewish tradition of living the life of prayer. You know, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see that all comes from those people who were living that life. So when Christianity began to develop, what happened in early Christianity was the martyrdom, right? They were killing all the Christians. And so they fled. And that sort of was the impetus to go out into the desert to live the life and live their faith in prayer. In some cases, they would come after them and they would give themselves up, but nonetheless. But then what happened when the martyrdom ended? When Christianity became kind of official and allowed and legalized? Many of them began to think, well, we cannot give ourselves up to death anymore, but we can die to the world. And so that's really people like St. Anthony started to develop this. And he did it to flee from people, right? He wanted to get away from everybody so he could live a life of prayer. Well, they all followed him into the desert. And then he wanted to flee a little bit farther, and they all followed him there. And finally he gave up and he said, well, all right, we'll just start forming this community and start living this life of prayer. There are many, Father Cleopa, who recently died and will be canonized. He was a Romanian monk who also he found shelter in the OCA. And he was one of those people, like he kept, during the communist persecution of the Orthodoxy, he would flee into the mountains, and then people would follow him, like, you're telling him where I am. And then he'd flee farther in the mountains, and finally he just said, okay, fine, just everyone, I can't do that. So anyway, so he became the founder of what they call anchorite monasticism. What does that sound like? Anchorite. What does that word remind you of?
Angry.
No, anchorite.
Boat anchor.
A boat anchor, exactly right. What does a boat anchor do?
Well, it holds something in place.
There you go. You got it. You passed the test. So anchorite means that they're going to stay in one place. Rather than being kind of nomads and moving around to different places, they decided this is where we're going to be. And we're going to establish a community here and build a community there. St. Catherine's being the first of those, really. And monasticism kind of spread then throughout the world. You had monasteries in the middle of cities. So one of the most famous is Mar Saba in Jerusalem, which many of the services that we do developed out of Mar Saba. It kind of put all the stuff together. There were some that were in the middle of nowhere. There were some that were huge, monsters, thousands and thousands of monks or nuns, and there were some that just a couple. And it's interesting because since the fall of communism now, monasticism in Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe has just had a huge revival. And they're now packed with people who have dedicated their lives to prayer. So St. Pachomius, he died... So Anthony the Great, just to give you an idea, 251 to 356. So again, even before the Bible was put together, they were doing this. Pachomius, who died in 246, he founded this idea of Cenobitic. In other words, we're all going to live in common. And then what they call idiorhythmic, which means it's kind of this, but not quite that. And so that was also founded. So the church had a real hard time. Like as monasticism became a force within the church, that's where the education went on. That's where many of the great theologians, St. Gregory, the theologian, our patron, that's not him, but St. Gregory, the theologian, our patron, right? So he was like this really kind of rich, spoiled kid and had like the best education. And him and Basil the Great and his brother Gregory, Basil the Great's brother Gregory the Nazianzen, they thought, oh, it wouldn't be really cool, we'll go move. Well, now we're done, with all of our education, we're going to go move and we're going to pray, live on in a cave, on the Black Sea, and it would be like hippies kind of. And they lasted just a short time because it was too hard for them, right? So everyone had this idea they were going to go off and do that. So, anyway, so the church had to really deal with this. And that's where Basil the Great, during that experience, decided, okay, here are the rules. And if we're going to follow these rules, and even the Roman Catholics, in a sense, use the same rules that Basil the Great and the Orthodox still use. They've changed a little bit. But so they introduced things like special garments. How do you manage? How do you have a bunch of people in the same place, and who's in charge, who's not in charge? How do you divide everything up? And so the whole point was to spend their life in prayer. More importantly, what they would call pray without ceasing. That every breath that they took would be the name of Christ. It comes right from some of when Christ tells people to pray without ceasing. And so they literally developed that, and they developed the tradition of the prayer rope, right? That's a prayer rope. And each of those knots, they have what's called the Jesus prayer. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And they actually develop their breath and everything with it, and they do these knots. Mine's a small one, they have some monks. But it's and they get obediences. So when you become a monk or nun, you place yourself under the control of the abbot or the abbess. And they'll tell you, you need to do 1,000 of these a day. And then they keep building it up. And I've seen monks and nuns, they're cutting trees down, and they're still doing the prayer rope as they're cutting the trees down. It's just an amazing sort of discipline. So as it grew, and monasticism grew, it also became the protector of the church. So even to this day, when the church is kind of challenged theologically, the monks and nuns will kind of emerge from the monasteries, set everything right, and then they'll go back, right? So you don't want to see the monks or nuns emerging to kind of argue with the bishops. That means you probably are on a bad road there. But they all kind of create, and as monasticism spread, it spreads throughout the entire Orthodox world. So you may have a flavor like Mount Athos is clearly of a Byzantine flavor, but then you go up to Russia and there's huge monasteries that were created there. And in fact, they became kind of part of the missionary work that was being done, that the monks would go out and bring Christianity all throughout the world. And in some cases, they would live in one place and people would get attracted to them. And then you may have others like Herman, who came to Alaska to establish the church here in America, and through his life and his example became this great witness for Christianity. So they have different flavors. So I'm trying to get through some of this stuff. So anyway, so what happens then eventually is that because the monastics are the educated people, the bishops are drawn from them. So now to this day, all bishops in the church have to take monastic vows. So that's why they wear the garb, that black hat with the veil, because that's a monastic hat. We'll talk about that in a second. So even if they're not a monastic, if they're elected bishop, they have to go and take monastic vows and live as a monk. Like Archbishop Michael, our bishop, he was a widow, right? He was married, he was widowed, and when he was elected bishop of the diocese, he had to go through and take all the monastic vows. So anyway, there are a growing number of monasteries in America. The closest one we have, obviously, Yosie one, St. Tikhon's. We have New Skeet up in Cambridge, New York. We have the Holy Myrrh Bearers up in Otsego, New York. There's a Greek monastery in Middletown now. But there are growing monasteries throughout the country. Some are healthy and some are not so healthy. I'll just tell you that. So if you're going to want to visit a monastery, talk to me first. Right.
So what's the distinction between a monastery that is healthy and one that is not healthy? Is it perhaps like the unhealthy one, it's like there's not a lot of monks there, there's not a lot of interest in that? Or?
No, I think, sometimes it's that case where, they've aged, they didn't get new people in, So they're kind of not able to do what they need to do. In some cases, certain abbots are, how shall I say, can be difficult, right? We'll just keep it at that. So, and some monasteries, they're just healthy. They've got, like St. Tikhon's, when I would say 20 years ago, was one of those places like, oh brother, they're in trouble. Now with Father Sergius, they have had such a revival, and they've got so many young monks, and it's really like impressive to see what they're doing. So it's on a healthy sort of bound. It's hard. America never had the tradition, go to these old Orthodox countries, it's very much a tradition established for 1,000, 1,500, 1,700, 1,800 years. In America, we're still new in that sense, because remember, 200 years, we're just getting going. And so the traditions are growing. I'd say the healthiest women's monastery is probably the two Romanian ones in Michigan. One was founded by the daughter of the last king of Romania, and she was quite remarkable. Read her story. And both of those monasteries are just very, very healthy. Like young women, a lot of just good, solid stuff they're doing. Monasticism in Romania is very strong, very strong. Anyway, some provide, they have to support themselves, right? So they have different ways in which they support themselves. And some will, like our candles that we get, they're from a monastery. The nuns put, they do candles, so we buy from them to help them. Some will do painting. The myrrh bearers, they raise sheep and all that other. If you go to the wool fair here in Dutchess County, you always see the nuns from New Skeet there, or from Otago rather. The New Skeet nuns made cheesecake. They were really good cheesecakes, by the way. So they all have like different things in which they'll do to support themselves. But their primary job has always praying, right? And so it's a very regimented style of life in which you go from prayer to prayer to prayer throughout the day. Now you have someone up here, you have Mother Maria of Paris. So she founded a monastery of Russian exiles in Paris, and she was dedicated to doing social work among the poor. She took the place of a Jewish woman and went and died in a concentration camp. Duchess Elizabeth, her husband, the brother of the Tsar, was killed, murdered right before the revolution. She founded a group of nuns who did and worked among all the poor and the wounded who were happening. The communists threw her down a well and threw hand grenades on her. Some, not all of them end that way, by the way, but there are some who do incredible work among the poor or the hospitals or do all that sort of stuff. But again, it's not like their primary job. Their primary job, I cannot emphasize this enough, is praying. So commonly, and one thing I have to say, this is very important. You don't go to a monastery to escape from the world. You go to a monastery to engage the world, right? And you do that in a different way. You have to be able to pray for them. You have to be engaged with people. They don't shut themselves off in that certain sense, but they come to be part of the world. So if you think that and by the way, all the problems that you may have outside the monastery will probably still be there when you go into the monastery, which is why it's really important. I haven't sent, but recommended 2 women who went to monasteries. And it was after a very serious time of discernment, because I wanted to make sure they were understanding, first off, what it was they were getting into, because it's not an easy life in that sense, but also so that they understood, how this was going to be a different part of them now. And in a certain sense, you die to the old person. In fact, you're given a new name when you get your final vows, and you start living a new life. But the whole point is you can't Like you don't send someone there to get healthy. You send someone there to be, who is healthy and has that gift, that calling to live that life. And it is a difficult life. You're going to ask me.
Yeah, so what you said earlier about monasteries not rejecting the world, do you mean that like they're engaging in the world, but like in a more spiritual sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just give you an example. This is a typical day in a monastery. Right? So you start at probably 5 or 6 in the morning, and you go to matins, right? Which is about an hour long, and that's the service of the rising of the sun. Then you may have a liturgy afterwards. Then you go and you have the first hour, so you have first, third, sixth, and ninth hour. That roughly corresponds to 6, 9, noon, 3 o'clock. You stop what you're doing, you go to pray. Then you have Vespers as the sun goes down. Then you have Compline, which is prayers that you do in the evening before you go to bed. Then when you go to bed, you're woken up at midnight, so you can go and do Nocturne and do the prayers in the middle of the night. And then if you're like in St. Catherine's in the Egyptian desert, you do most of your work at night, right? Because it's too hot to work during the day, right? So they do a lot of their work during the night. So your question is like, well, when do they sleep? Very little. And by the way, then you have your own personal rule that you do in the monastery. You do in your what they call your room is your cell. You have a personal prayer rule that you'll do, and many will not sleep. They'll be praying throughout the night, and it's kind of again. And then when they do have the meals together, they eat in common, and usually the church fathers are read, or there's certain things that are read while they're eating, and then they'll have quiet time. You know, we'll do some work together. I mean, it's a pretty busy and pretty regimented life. So if it's a woman's monastery, they'll have a priest who will be assigned there. And that priest will come in at certain times and do prayers for them and offer the liturgy and lead the services. If it's a men's monastery, they'll take certain monks and they'll make them deacons. They'll be called a hierodeacon, or a priest, a hieromonk. That means a priest and also a monk. Or they'll have someone who's an igumen. He's a priest monk who's also in charge of. And then they have an archimandrite, which is a priest monk who's basically in charge of all of them. And to be an abbot, you have a lot of power, basically. And they vote on this. They who do they trust and who are they going to allow them to go. It's interesting too, like in St. Catherine's, there was, you have these rooms, and these rooms have been there for 1,500 years. And so if you're assigned to this room, then your name is going to be Nectarius. Because every monk who's ever lived there for 1,500 years is named Nectarius. So you're now in Nectarius. You're just one in the line of people. And it's kind of a beautiful way in which you have. So it's hard. Again, I've been to monasteries. I've been to all over the world. I've been to monasteries. It's hard to explain it. You have to kind of learn how to like see it, like see them in action. And one of the things, if it's a healthy monastery, there's joy. There's just such great joy amongst the monks and nuns. Really are amazing. So that's part of it. So let's talk a little bit about the ranks. All right. So there is certain ranks that developed within there. This goes along with both monks and nuns. So the first thing that you are is you're called a novice. And a novice is someone who is discerning whether this is the life that they want to take. And so they'll wear a cassock, black. They don't get to wear different colors like me. And they may be given a belt, a leather belt with a buckle. usually it has like a picture of the monastery or the Theotokos. And they're kind of like low on the totem pole. They're going to do a lot of dirty work, and they're going to do a lot of the things, and just really be submitting themselves. At a certain point, they will, and by the way, they can be kicked out at any time. Every stage is voluntary. Some people stay as novices their entire life, like they don't take the next step. So the next step after that, again, because they're Russians and Greeks, you got to have two different words for the same thing. So you have, you will have the next people will be called the Ryasaphor. A Ryasaphor. So what is a Ryasaphor? So they will then take the first steps towards becoming an official monk or nun. They will be tonsured. They'll cut the hair. They'll be given a Ryasaphor. So you know when I wear that cloak with the big sleeves? That's a Ryasaphor. So now they just don't wear the cassock. They wear a Ryasa with it. And they'll have a head covering that they'll start to wear. They'll start to cut. Both monks and nuns will cover their hair. Sign of humility. All right? And so at that point, they may stay as a Ryasaphor for the rest of their life. Right? They're still not officially a monk or nun. They're just like now the next step. So the next step is called Stavrophor, all right? And which means, or little schema, which means they now are officially monks and nuns. That's when they get the hat with the veil, both monks and nuns. They will receive, they'll take a vow of stability, chastity, obedience, and poverty. And that's when they get their tonsure. So it's very interesting, the tonsure service. So the bishop will come, and the person will come up and do his prayers, and then he'll take the scissors. And 3 times he'll slide the scissors down the church. And the person has to go and pick it up and bring it back to the bishop. So it's like, are you sure? Are you really sure? Are you really, really sure? And that's how, and then they'll get their tonsure and all of that. So why Stavrophor? Because they'll wear underneath, unless the monks are ordained, they will be wearing a cross, but it'll be underneath their cassock. So sometimes it's a square piece of cloth, and it's embroidered with a cross and prayers that they'll wear. Sometimes it looks like, my epitracheal, that thing that I wear around my neck. Sometimes it's a shorter version of that, but you'll never see it, right? It's supposed to be hidden. St. Herman wore one that was of iron chains. They didn't know that until after he died. You could still see them up at Kodiak. And then they are considered, they're given a new name. They are given a wooden cross that they'll carry for the rest of their life. And they'll wear what's called a mantia. So remember when the bishop came in, and this is, I'm trying to find something that's a mantia in the icons. So it's that long robe that he wears, and it's got, for a bishop it's purple with the stripes, or like for example St. Tikhon, it's blue. It's that long, so monks wear just one, and nuns wear ones that are just black. That's where it comes from too. So it's their mantia. In fact, when they die, there's a way you cut it and you tie them in their mantia before they're buried. It's like also their burial shroud. And so they wear the mantia at services. They don't wear it walking around, but at services. And again, they may stay there their rest of their life. That's when most monks that you see, they'll remain Stavrophor or little schema. There's one last and highest level of monastics. And this is, again, monks or nuns. And if you see any of them, they're probably not real. They're probably faking it. And they are called great schema. They are incredible people. They have lived their entire life in his prayers. They are known for their wisdom. They will live very often in isolation. They've now dedicated themselves totally. They wear a garment, it's hard to explain, but on the outside or on a stole, it'll be all these prayers written all over them, right? I've seen maybe 3 or 4 in my life when I was overseas. I don't know if we have any in America. I've never heard of it. There are people who dress like it, but they're not real. They are treated with great respect. They're often called elder or garanta in Greek, or starets in Russian. And they are known, and people will come from all over to talk to them and to get their advice. And they have they're just incredible people. Like the peace that you feel from them is really palpable. And they live their life in prayer, total prayer. And they're granted that privilege, like they've been a monk or nun for like 50 years and have just showed themselves so dedicated in such a level of spiritual life that it's just beyond belief. So again, we already talked about the different things. So the abbot or the abbess is the one who's in charge of the monastery. Normally they are voted on by the brothers or the sisters, and they'll be given a staff. You know, when the bishop comes in, he carries that staff. I'm just trying to find icons here. That little staff, they will be awarded a staff as well that they'll carry. They have the power. You don't mess with them. You especially don't mess with abbesses. When I was taking care of a women's monastery, you know, she said, "You sleep there, Father. If we need you, we'll tell you. Don't go wandering around, you know." Yes, ma'am. Yeah. But it is really, truly a gift. And if you want to get a taste of it, if you want to see what it's like, there's a Russian movie that came out a number of years ago called The Island, The Isle. It is an incredible movie about a monk in a Russian monastery and just the gifts that he had and what he was able to do. How do you address a monk or nun? All right. So if you see them in a cassock with kind of a hat, it's either father or male or mother, right? They're all fathers and mothers, right? If you see a novices, they're brothers and sisters. You know, brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so. But they're all considered father or they're considered mother. By the way, in certain monasteries, women's monasteries, the abbess actually receives communion on the altar table like the priests. And they wear a cross, like a fancy gold, fancy cross that they're awarded as well. So, but it is a remarkable sort of life. Again, I'm not a monk. I don't play one on TV. But I am so humbled by the people, especially the young people who have taken up this lifestyle and taken up their cross on our behalf. And so if you get a chance, go to see a monastery, go to talk to the monks and nuns. Every now and then we have some that come through here and, ask them. Just ask them. How did you decide this? And what? I had 2 students this year at seminary. One was a medical doctor who left everything to become a monk, and the other was he had his doctorate in pharmaceutical, and he left to become a monk. And then there was another one there who was these were very well-paid professionals who very early decided that this was going to be their calling, and they left everything and became monks and nuns. And they're in a monastery in Arizona. There are incredible people who do it. There are some that shouldn't be monks or nuns, let's put it that way. But that's another story. Any questions on that? All right, so we have the next part of the class, which I wanted to talk a little bit about asceticism. Because obviously that's the key part of being a monk or nun, is living what they call the ascetic life. So, it comes from the word ascesis, the Greek word, and that means to devote, to dedicate, to live a certain way, right? Very often we see asceticism as, well, this self-denial and, let's destroy the body and do all these other sort of things. And it's not at all, really. I mean, it's maybe part of it, but it's really not this idea. But it's this idea of living in a disciplined way of life, right? A disciplined way of life. And this is not something that, I make up. It's something that's been practiced in the Orthodox Church for 2,000 years. And so for us to be able to live this particular life means that we're developing a better understanding of not only who we are, but how we relate to God. So who can give me some ideas of what an ascetical discipline may be?
Maybe like what you said earlier, not eating meat.
There are times in the church when we do fasting, right? So we've already had a class on that. But we have about 180 days of the year when we don't eat meat. Now we're coming, the Great Lent, Advent, or the Nativity fast. We're coming up to the Apostles' fast. We have the Dormition fast, and then Wednesdays and Fridays, unless we have a fast-free week, like we do after Pentecost, we don't eat meat. Right? Just one of those things. Why do we do that? It's not necessarily, we do it to celebrate. We do it to celebrate and to offer to God. The easiest thing we can do is avoid putting something in our mouth, right? And so it's part of that discipline. It's not an easy one, by the way. If you really live the life, because then you can even ratchet up, and then you don't do dairy as well. Then you don't do fish. Then you don't do olive oil. And, you can really ratchet it up. But you do it according to what you're capable of doing. And again, you should do it with joy. Joy, that's what Christ says, right? When you fast, don't put on a sad countenance, put oil on your face, don't let anybody know what you're doing. So that's an easy one, right? As St. John Chrysostom says, you can't control what comes in your mouth, how are you going to control what comes out? Right? So that's a good one. Any other thought besides fasting? Go ahead.
Definitely praying at different times.
Prayer rule. Excellent. So living according to a prayer rule. Now, the prayer rule you come up with, you work together with your father, confessor, your priest, on what you're capable of doing. Like if I'm a young mother who's got 4 kids, and if you can get 5 minutes of prayer in a day, God bless you, right? Your prayer is your kids, taking care of that. If you're an older person who, maybe is housebound, well, then you could live a more structured life of prayer. But be able to dedicate a personal prayer every day is an important part of our ascetical discipline, right? It's our way of connecting with God. And we have prayers that the church has been doing for 2,000 years. It helps you. You could pray throughout the day in your brain or whatever. You could do your prayer rope. I mean, there are all different ways you do it. If you could do a morning prayer, great. If you could do a night prayer, great. Whatever it is, you put that discipline before yourself, right? And so that you're connecting with God as often as you can. Any other? You may have another one.
Sacraments?
Yeah, partaking of all those things that we're called to do, right? Coming to confession regularly, right? Coming to the communion, coming to all those different things, all the services and all that stuff. It's an ascetical discipline, right? I get it. Like, how long do you drive to get here? 45 minutes? I get it. It's a drive. But nonetheless, it's part of your ascetical life is to come in and celebrate these services. I can't do it by myself, right? It has to be something that we're all trying to do in our life. I don't know what I did with my pages. I was a mess today. Anyway, so that's another one. Living that life in the church, right? As I talked about, you can't be a Christian by yourself. You have to be a Christian in a community, right? Because if you're a Christian by yourself, you'll probably figure out something that's weird. But if you're in a community, you have accountability to one another. So being able to kind of discipline yourself in that community is an important part of it. Can you see here that word come up? Discipline. It's not a word that should be feared. And it's certainly not like you're going to get, whipped or anything like that. But it's a way in which you have to think of yourself, to train your body, to train your mind, to live a life. It's no different than anything. If you're going to be in a sport, you got to train yourself. Well, as a Christian, you got to train yourself. Can anybody think of another ascetical discipline? Yes?
Giving up worldly pleasures.
Yeah. So living that life of what we would say stewardship, right? Stewardship. So all that you have is God's, right? He just lets us use it. And so if we have certain things that we can do to help others, then we should do that if it's within our power, right? Now, not all of us are called to give up all our wealth and follow Christ. That may be a calling, but there are people who are all called to do something. So in a certain sense, your ascetical discipline is your neighbor, right? What did Christ say? What's the greatest commandment? Yes, love to God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then he said, and the second is like this. Love your neighbor as yourself. I'm literally writing something on this right now for the diocese. But to love your neighbor as yourself. So the ascetical discipline is how can we love our neighbor? Because some neighbors are really hard to love, right? They really challenge us. But yet we're called to. We're called to present ourselves as a Christian. And sometimes to be able to do something out there. To help someone in a way that they needed help. Even if they don't like you, and even if they're going to be mean to you. But then to be able to give up, there's a wonderful scene in that movie about St. Nectarius that we all went to see in the theaters. And he had a man who was without shoes. Of course, he's a saint. But he said, he gave him his shoes. He said, I have 2 shoes. I don't even need 1 set. You need 1 set. He gave him the shoes. So, not that we're all called to do that, but is there something that we live in kind of luxury? That someone could be of need, and we can help them in a very small and modest way. It's a hard one. It's probably one of the more challenging ones, because it requires us to get outside of ourselves and to think of something beside ourselves. And if we have abundance, we give. And if we don't have abundance, we give. Because it's beyond us. So good one. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
What about a person who has nothing? What do they give?
You pray. You pray. Right? And you live your life. Again, the point is not what you do, what you give. The point is that you're giving. So remember, Christ talks about the widow's mite, right? A mite is a very small coin. This is a widow. She has no money. She gives that mite because the point is in the giving, not in the amount, right? So you do what you can do. And again, no one's going to sit there and look over your shoulder saying, well, give a little bit more. What are you doing there? That's not what our job is. It's got to come from you, what your heart's going to tell you on what to do, right? A steward, in Greek, ikonomos, is someone who takes care of the household on behalf of the master, right? And so we are all called to be an ikonomos. We taking care of the house on behalf of the master, whatever that house may be. So the church being one of them. Okay. Other questions? Or other thoughts? You hit most of the biggies. But there are different things that you can set for your lifestyle that are an ascetical discipline. Remember, that word comes from the word training, right? So how are you going to train ourselves to think and to be in God? And so some of those, I always say, a young mother has some of the most amazing ascetical disciplines raising their children. I used to always joke, my wife, Matushka, when our two kids were small, she was directing choir and she had the two kids. And, she doesn't have any help from me because I'm back at the altar, right? And I said, that was her ascetical discipline, not going crazy trying to do all this. What a beautiful gift that is. We have all those little kids running around here on Sundays, and, that's a beautiful gift. And some people are like, well, pray for the mother, right? Pray for the mother. We've all been there, a lot of us have been there. So, do what you can do. But whatever you can do to focus yourself on God. This is how I'm going to explain it. So, Father Schmemann gave advice as to if someone in the seminary would come and say, I want to become a monk, or I want to become a nun. And he would kind of go, yeah, that's interesting. All right. Before I give you the recommendation, this is what I want you to do. And you got to do this for like a year. Get a menial job, like working at McDonald's, scrubbing the floor of McDonald's, or something like that. Any money you earn, you give to the church. You live in a strict prayer rule that will be assigned to you. And you live a very strict ascetical life. You go to every service that the church has, and you will be obedient to the priest or whatever he tells you. He says, do that for 5 years, and I'll give you a recommendation to go to the monastery. Now that's why? Because that's what they're going to be doing in a monastery, right? They think, we're going to think big thoughts and, have great discussions. No, they're going to work on behalf of each other. But in that sense, I want you to just think about that. What is it in our life that we can do that will give us a sort of an ascetical discipline in our own life so we can learn to live closer and closer to what God gives us? So, I can't tell you the answer to that. I don't have the powers to see into your hearts. I just know that all I can do is point. And whatever you decide, you do. And be faithful to it. And expect to fail. That's okay. That's normal. I love this one church father gave the definition of a monk. It's someone who falls, stands up, falls, stands up, falls, stands up, and does that for the rest of their life. We're all going to fall. We're all going to stand up. And all we can do is just keep moving forward and pointing to Christ. God is infinite. So we can infinitely approach him. We can infinitely grow towards him and never reach him. But yet, that's what we're called to do. Any questions? All right. 1 hour. Look at that. Exactly. So no class next week because it's my anniversary. But the Thursday after that, we're going to start wrapping up this year's sessions and take a little break for the summer. So I think I'm going to talk about how to be a parishioner. Like how do you be a parishioner in a parish? And we'll kind of discuss those type of things. All right, let's pray. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. It is truly me to bless you, Theotokos, ever blessed and the most pure and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, you gave birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify you. Through the prayers of the Holy Fathers of Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Okay.